Divine appointments. We have appointments for everything, don't we? We have doctor's appointments. We have appointments with a dentist, job interview. We have an appointment with somebody for lunch. The list goes on and on. Have you ever thought about how we also might have had, whether we knew it or not, a divine appointment with God in the past? Or perhaps you are experiencing an appointment with God for a particular thing right now, or you might anticipate something that is still in the future. I think the Bible speaks of these divine appointments in different ways, and we want to look here this morning at how some of these unexpected events or turn of events have a way of turning into divine appointments in our lives. First of all, we want to suggest to you that a chance meeting might be a divine appointment. On your outline there, number one, just some kind of incidental or accidental meeting, a chance meeting, might be a divine appointment. Do you think that when Ruth just chanced to meet Boaz and work for him, that chance meeting might have been arranged by God, and that it was actually a divine appointment that was going to take place, that needed to take place for God to fulfill what he intended to fulfill in future days? There's an amazing story here, and I want you to think, as we mention some appointments that we see reflected in Scripture, have you had some divine appointments? And I want you to think about that and how sometimes you might have known, or you might have looked back later and said, I believe God was involved in that. One of the most amazing divine appointments to me is 2 Kings chapter 8. It's a great story. It's about a Shunammite woman who lost her son, and Elisha, who was the successor of Elijah, raised this boy from the dead. During a time of famine, she has spent 7 years away from home. And it is likely that she lost her property through some means. That's kind of the background of this story. And then she goes back home, and she's probably wondering what's going to happen. But follow this story, 2 Kings chapter 8, beginning in verse 1. Elisha had told this woman, whose son he had brought back to life, take your family, move to some other place, for the Lord has called for a famine on Israel that will last for 7 years. So the woman did as the man of God instructed. She took her family and settled in the land of the Philistines for 7 years. And the famine ended. After it ended, she returned from the land of the Philistines. She went to see the king about getting back her house and land. What am I going to do now? Back home, but do I still have my property? Can I get it? As she came in, the king was talking with Gehazi. Well, isn't that a coincidence? Gehazi is the servant of Elisha, the servant of the man of God. The king had just said, tell me some stories about the great things Elisha has done. Well, here this widow who has been in contact with Elisha in the past, he raised her son from the dead. King wants to know, you got any interesting stories, Gehazi, about Elisha and all the things that he's done? And this woman walks in. And Gehazi was telling the king about the time Elisha had brought a boy back to life. At that very moment, the mother of the boy walked in to make her appeal to the king about her house and land. Look, my lord the king, Gehazi exclaimed, here is the woman now, and this is her son, the very one Elisha brought back to life. Well, can you beat that for a coincidence? Or is that a divine appointment? Is this true? The king asked her. And she told him the story. So he directed one of his officials to see that everything she had lost was restored to her. including the value of any crops that had been harvested during her absence. Wouldn't you like your bank or someone in authority to say, you know, the last 7 years that you didn't get any payoff from your land, that's going to come to you? I think this was a divine appointment that she just happened to walk in at the right time precisely while Gehazi and the king were discussing her and her son. A divine appointment. Has anything ever happened to you by chance like that? I remember in my own experience, I went to the Pepperdine Lectures in the early 70s. And I went to this little class. It was taught by Gerald Kendrick, who happened to be from Albuquerque, New Mexico. That's why we say it around here in honor of the Hardcastle grandson, Landon, who told us the proper pronunciation of Albuquerque. It's Albuquerque. That's a lot sweeter than that other old way. But anyway, this preacher from Albuquerque was there. And it was a small class. There were just 6 of us, and the class was on prayer. And I noticed there was this one individual I hadn't seen before who was in the class, and the guy just had a smile that radiated, and he was laughing, and he was smiling all the time. And my first thought was, okay, another phony preacher. But it wasn't. It was Elmer Prout. And I didn't know who he was. I found out who he was. And then I found out he preached just up the road from Ripon, where I was at the time, in Roseville. I thought, I got to check this guy out. I mean, that can't be real. The guy is all the time up for the various days we met in this class. And so I went and I visited and listened to him preach. I thought, he's a pretty good preacher. And I introduced myself to him afterward and told him I was a graduate of Abilene Christian and was preaching down in Ripon. And he says, why don't we swap pulpits sometime? And my thought was, you don't know what you're doing. I preach for a small church. This is a bigger church. But I went for the deal. And eventually, after 3 years in Ripon, I moved to Roseville. And during that 6-year period of time that I was in Roseville, Elmer was in Japan with Geneva, his wife, for a 3-year mission tour. I believe that God's hand was in that we just sort of coincidentally ran into each other, and I bumped into his smile and had to check it out. And then it led to something more in my work and where I think God wanted me to be before I came here. And just incidentally, I don't want to bore you with this, but while I was in Ripon, that's when I first became acquainted with Exeter. The quartet, the prison ministry at San Quentin, they came by and sang at our youth rally and so forth. I believe these were all chance happenings, but God was involved in that. And I think some divine appointments came out of that. Secondly, we might experience a divine appointment when there's a change of plans. If you read in the scriptures, in Acts chapter 10, Peter is on his roof and he's up there for prayer. And there's this sheet of food that is lowered to him. And that seems like a good idea, you know. After prayer, you might want to eat. But then he noticed that some of the food was unclean, and he says, I can't eat that. And God says, what I've called clean, what I've cleansed, don't call unclean. And he still didn't go for it. The Lord did this 3 times and finally convinced him that if he had cleansed it, it was no longer unclean. And about that same time that that third vision appeared and disappeared, there was a knock at the door, and there were some people from visiting who wanted someone to come and talk to their master Cornelius, who happened to be praying on the other end of this long-distance conversation. And the Lord said to Peter, "Go with them," and he went with them. And the first thing he said, making a good impression as he went into the house, "You know, I'm not supposed to be here. I'm a religious Jew, I'm a holy man, and I'm going into a Gentile's house that is unclean." It still didn't dawn on him what the meaning of that threefold parable was that he had just partaken in. But he goes ahead and God intervenes and baptizes everyone with the Spirit. And he says, well, since God has done that, can we refuse them to be baptized with water? And he joined in agreement with what God had done. This was a divine appointment that just changed his plans. He was Jewishly oriented. Now he had to change the way he thought. He had to broaden his thinking and God does include clean people that I thought were unclean. Maybe some of us need to go through some of that same kind of experience as well. A change in our thinking, a change of plans can lead to a divine appointment. And then there's that story in Acts chapter 8 of Philip. God says, I want you to go out here into the desert, out into nowhere, and I want you to find a chariot and get on board. He joins the chariot. The man is reading Isaiah 53 about Jesus and the cross and the resurrection. He has no idea who he's reading about. Philip, by divine appointment, explains to him what that scripture is all about. The man is from Ethiopia. He's a eunuch. He can't have children. Look at the article on the inside of your bulletin. Philip wasn't sure why he was supposed to go out here and join this chariot. He was in the middle of a great revival in Samaria. And you know, you don't stop something that's on the roll. You don't stop something that's successful. But there's been a change of plan. Go out to nowhere, join the chariot. And so he does. And God had a new idea. He brought them together, the man from Ethiopia and Philip. He brought them together for a divine appointment, and the world would never be the same again. When the Ethiopian eunuch returned home, he started a family. Oh, not a biological family, but a spiritual one. You see, from this first convert, the Christian church in Ethiopia grew and grew until in the 4th century, Christianity became the official religion of the nation. And Ethiopia was the longest standing continuously Christian nation in the history of the world until 1974 with the fall of Emperor Haile Selassie. Even today, African Christianity is the most dynamic and fastest growing church in the world. I believe it all started with a conversation one day between two men in the middle of a desert on the road to Gaza. Why should he leave a successful revival to start a new one in the middle of nowhere with a man who would take it back to Ethiopia? And I remember when I went to Africa in 1969, hearing about Ethiopia and the strength of the Christian church there. It started with that change of plans that was divinely orchestrated by God. Well, also in connection with this, remember the story of Esther? She had just become the new queen. She's been in for about 5 months. And there is sort of the prime minister under Xerxes, the emperor, who wants to wipe out the Jews. He's got it in from Mordecai, the uncle of Esther, because he won't show him the honor and won't kneel and bow and so forth and show him the respect that certainly he knows he deserves. And he has it in for Mordecai, but he says, why stop with him? Just get rid of all the Jews. He had learned of, this is Haman now, he had learned of Mordecai's nationality, so he decided it was not enough to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Instead, he looked for a way to destroy all the Jews through the entire empire of Xerxes. So in the month of April, during the 12th year of King Xerxes' reign, now the month of April, March, April, is the beginning of the new year, on the religious calendar of the Jews. This is also Passover time. This is a celebration of God taking them out of their slavery, bringing them into the new land. The Passover, they are now a new people. They're not who they once were. Okay? Haman, at this time of the year, cast lots in his presence. The lots were called Purim, to determine the best days and month to take action. And the day selected was March 7th, nearly a year later, the end of the religious Jewish year. Okay? P-U-R, Pur, is lot, and the I-M on the end is the plural of that, casting lots. It's sort of like the roll of the dice, and whatever comes up, you go with that particular choice. It is interesting that at the beginning of the Jewish year, Haman wanted to make them history. He wanted to wipe them out, okay? And the lots fell on the end of the year, 11 months later, around February, March, when the Jewish year would end, that's when they were going to be annihilated. Well, dispatches were sent by swift messengers into all the provinces of the empire, giving order that all Jews, young and old, including women and children, must be killed, slaughtered, and annihilated on a single day. This was scheduled to happen on March 7th of the next year. The property of the Jews would be given to those who killed them. So, a little motivation here. Mordecai knows about this. He sends a reply to his niece, Esther, and he says, you're in a position where you can do something about this. And don't fail to realize that this may be by divine appointment. That's what he's saying, although God's name is never mentioned. Don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you will escape when all the other Jews are killed. He says, this is going to come and get you too. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place. But you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this. It's not accidental. Perhaps this is in the plan of God. You intended to rule in a peaceful reign as queen. Plans have been changed. You're going to have to do something to help save our people. And as we know, Esther had a role in that, and the day next year, March 7th, the day when the slaughter was supposed to take place, the king couldn't reverse the law of the Medes and the Persians. It had to stay, but he granted them that they could fight for themselves. And that particular day came and went, and they slaughtered the Persians who were out after them. Haman and his 10 sons were all executed. Okay? A change of plans. Because someone had this divine appointment, was put in a particular position where she could do something at that particular time. Save herself and save her people. There's an interesting passage in Proverbs that says the lot is cast into the lap, but the decision is the Lord's alone. When you roll the dice, it looks like just pure luck. And isn't it interesting that Haman rolled the dice or cast the lot and decided what day this was to take place? That was his plot. And that plot was foiled when that lot picked the day that he and his people were slaughtered instead. Okay? Divine appointments. Have you ever sensed something like that in your own life? Finally here, detours, delays, and disappointments can be his appointments. Now, we put it that way because I wanted you to see there's only one letter's difference between disappointments and his appointments. Change the D for an H. and disappointments become His appointments. Have you ever experienced a detour? You were headed in this direction, but you got detoured. Maybe it was a divine detour. Maybe it was something you just wandered off on your own. But sometimes God may be behind those detours and delays. For example, the children of Israel, just after they've left Egypt, when Pharaoh finally let the people go, God did not lead them along the main road that runs through Philistine territory, even though that was the shortest route to the promised land. God said if the people are faced with a battle, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So we're not going to go direct. We're going to do some wandering around. It's going to be a divine detour. And maybe you wanted to go directly into this, or you wanted to challenge directly this. But God says we need some time for you to mature and to rethink this, as He told His people here as they left Egypt. So God led them in a roundabout way through the wilderness toward the Red Sea. Thus the Israelites left Egypt like an army ready for battle. Maybe you thought you were ready. Maybe you thought, now's the time. Here's the goal. Go directly toward it. And obstacles, delays, detours came in. That may be part of the upper story plan. In the story, Randy Frazee talks about upper story and lower story. We see things from our human perspective. That's the lower story. But there's also something going on in the upper story, in the councils of heaven, where God may be working out this, where we think we're only doing this down here. And there may be a divine appointment that God is leading us toward. When we had 9/11, and thanks to Rick for putting this picture up here, and it reminds us of the Twin Towers that the planes flew into. Shortly after that, we were stunned. I don't know where you were when you got the news about 9/11. Most of us have pretty good memories of that. And we got a call from Oklahoma, from the Grahams. And Barbara Graham said, "Have you got your TV on? Are you watching the news?" And no, we didn't. Turn it on. And one of the planes had already flown into the North Tower. And I thought, boy, how could that happen? And it wasn't long after that, about 20 minutes later, I think, that the second plane flew into the South Tower. And I knew immediately, and maybe you thought the same thing, these are not two accidents that close together with that kind of dramatic impact. And my next thought, and I read this online, and the guy was thinking the same thing I was, the immediate thought I had was, things are never going to be the same. Do you think that? Something's happened here. We don't know all the details yet. And then, of course, later, that third plane went down, didn't have a chance to get to whatever its target was, and they're still wondering where would it have gone had it not been for the rebellion on the plane. And I'd have been right with them. If we're going to go down, let's go down where I want it to go down rather than where they want it to go down. You got to do something. So there was that intervention there. And after that, there was a spike in church attendance. And maybe some felt like this is a wake-up call. This is God making an appointment with me to get my house in order. And then as time went by, that was sort of forgotten. And now we're drifting in the other direction. Divine appointments, we may not recognize them because they look ugly, they're difficult. But every time we go through a difficulty or a disappointment, I think God wants us to be better listeners. And I think an appropriate prayer, anytime we go through something that's difficult, is, Lord, what do you want me to hear? What do you want me to learn in this experience? Joseph, we'll get to him in class in just a few minutes. He says to his brothers, when he reveals himself to them in chapter 45 of Genesis, don't be upset. Don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. This famine that has ravaged the land for 2 years will last 5 more years, and there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. God has sent me ahead of you to keep you and your families alive and to preserve many survivors. So it was God who sent me here, not you. And he is the one who made me an advisor to Pharaoh, the manager of his entire palace and the governor of all Egypt. I wonder how long it took Joseph to figure that out. I mean, do you think he was a little bit disappointed in his brothers when they thought about killing him? And then they thought, no, let's don't kill him. Let's make some money off him. Sold him into slavery. And then he gets there and things are working out for him. The Lord was with him. And then Potiphar's wife accuses him of attempted rape. And he's thrown in the clink for a few years. But God prospered him in prison. And then there just happened to be these two fellows, the king's baker and the king's butler, who had these dreams, and he interpreted their dreams for them. The baker didn't turn out so well. The butler, he says, you're going to be restored to service. And when you get back to serving the king, would you remember me? Tell him that I'm okay. Let him know that I'm here in prison unjustly. And the guy forgets it until Pharaoh has a dream himself. And he says, you know what? I forgot all about that guy. He's good on dreams. And they bring Joseph in. Joseph says, only God can interpret accurately dreams. Pharaoh's guys, you know, they want to tell us your dream, we'll tell you the meaning. No, 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 no. You tell me my dream, and then you tell me the meaning. Let's keep this honest, okay? Joseph is able to do it with God's help. How disappointed was he? How difficult was all of those years in prison? But he was God's man, even there. He had a divine appointment wherever he was, blessing whoever he came in contact with. And then later, a divine appointment to forgive his brothers. And he says, I'm guessing here, he probably held it against them for a while. I think he still had it against them when he wouldn't reveal himself to them. He wanted to make them sweat. That's my theory. But somewhere along the way, whether it was before that or about that time, God changed his heart and he forgave them. And he says, I see it now in a whole new perspective from the upper story. All I could see at one time here is what I saw my circumstance in this lower story, reasoning, but it was God at work orchestrating this, arranging this, and he's brought this about. I'd love to hear afterward some of your divine appointment stories. Maybe you have a story about a divine appointment. Your marriage may even have happened through divine appointment. Something with your children. But what I want us to do today is reflect on how God, whenever we can't see and always know why and what for, some of those questions that Rick asked, that God is always at work. If you need to respond, would you do that while we stand and sing?